Good day, all. It's such a privilege to be able to be addressing you and participating in these very poignant discussions. Today, Dave and I will be having a conversation. I'd like to briefly introduce myself. I'm Kopano. I'm a physiotherapist based up in Hilton and consider myself somewhat of a social activist. Today, I'll be in conversation with David Larsen, who is a director at a digital archiving company called Africa Media Online. Really, today, we're going to be engaging with what we have termed a hashtag Real Revolutionaries. Real Revolutionaries has been birthed out of what we saw the Black Lives Matter discussion coming right to the forefront globally, but also having a significant impact on the schools, particularly former Model C schools or private schools in the Midlands area where we live. What we saw was schools responding to this question of what it means for Black lives to matter within the school context. These schools have strong historical traditions and in a history which overlaps some of South Africa's darker history coming into the new South Africa, and the born-free generation having to grapple with the question of Black Lives Matter as it pertains to South Africa, having the movement birthed, or in this particular instance, being driven by the death of George Floyd in the United States of America. And the questions that we then needed to answer was, is the conceptual framework of race sufficient to be able to get us to where we aspire to be as a society? Really, the question we often see is, how do we respond to the very real social inequalities that persist in a post-apartheid South Africa? How do we challenge the relational tensions that continue to be experienced in our schools, in our malls, in our offices, in our churches, in our mosques, in our synagogues, though we are in a post-apartheid South Africa? And we know very regularly people look to a few frameworks. The easiest one is race. This week we've seen race coming to the forefront and coming, well, in two ways, really. First, in Cape Town, where a man identified himself as African, having previously identified himself as colored and being charged by the Department of Education, having those charges withdrawn. We've also seen this past week in Senekal, two opposing groups in the EFF and different farm organization groups almost coming to real blows over the question of race as it relates to race in the South African discussion, and whether or not land ownership is an issue or race is an issue, or whether race relates to land ownership. So really, we have had social inequality, there being poverty inequality and unemployment as means of trying to bring a redress to the injustices and the inequalities that persist. Race obviously has been used as a framework, even in legislature, with the different affirmative action bills. We've also even had different cultural understandings trying to be used as a way to build bridges. At times, even different religions have sought to be able to be the tools that actually bridge this divide. Now, we have seen that somewhat these have been helpful, but have been insufficient to bring to us the change we desire to see. Now, with that, I'm going to ask Dave, are there any other conceptual frameworks that we might look to in order to be able to respond to these real inequalities that persist in our everyday?
Yeah, thanks, Cops. And I think really you've outlined some real sort of ways in which we're trying to grapple with this issue. And as I've thought of it over actually many decades now, I've really come to start to grapple with something that undergirds culture. Because I think a lot of people identify themselves with their culture. So they might identify with race, they might identify with their economic situation, but they also very much identify with culture. And we're seeing in South Africa the attempt to bring us together on as you say, on the basis of all those things. But there's something that undergirds culture in particular, and that is worldview. And a worldview is the set of assumptions to which we approach reality and how we interpret reality. And so worldviews are really powerful because we're usually not aware of them. They are assumptions. Quite often, for those people who are working cross-culturally, you become aware of your worldview. But we're seeing, particularly in a situation in the historic schools of South Africa, the sort of former Model C and independent schools, where Black Lives Matter particularly has had a big impact. Really, what we're seeing there is a culture that is very set in these institutions, and people who are coming into these institutions who are not feeling at home. They're not feeling like this environment is hospitable to them. And that's because they are coming from another worldview generally, or maybe a set of other worldviews. And so I wonder if I can just share with you, because how this came about is I was running a program with young adults, primarily, very mixed group of people, and from many different cultures and backgrounds and race groups and so on. We workshop together. What are the worldviews that we live alongside here in KwaZulu-Natal region? And we came up with 8 worldviews at the end of the day. We were all in discussion, 8 worldviews, and I kind of want to share those 8 worldviews with you. So I'd like to run through these worldviews, these 8 worldviews that we identified. The first is the primal worldview. What we mean by primal is first, and you see these worldviews all over the world, in Europe, in South America, Southeast Asia, and so on. And really, these worldviews tend to be about maintaining harmony with the ancestors, maintaining harmony with my neighbors, and making sure everything is in balance and in harmony. The next worldview that we identified is the ancient Western worldview, and that really comes from the Greeks and the Romans and has had a huge influence on the modern West. And that worldview really starts with the myth of the Titans, where the Titans devoured the goddess Dionysius, and Zeus was so angry with them and he cut them open, and out of their bellies came human beings with an evil body and a spark of God. And that theme of an evil body and trying to escape the body into the realm of pure spirit or pure rationality has had a huge influence on the West. Derivative from the ancient Western worldview, and actually from a religious worldview, or particularly a Christian worldview, is the modern West. And the essential idea of the modern Western worldview is that people are an individual substance of rational nature, so that we have this rationality that we can encounter the world and understand the world. And so from that, the scientific method was developed, and we can go out there, we can discover the facts of reality, and that we can understand those, and then we can create technology in order to control our environment and become successful and achieve what we want: health, wealth, and happiness. Derivative from that is the postmodern Western worldview, and postmodernism is a reaction against the modern. So modernity created all sorts of excesses in terms of its control of the environment. So we ended up with an environmental crisis and its control of resources around the world. So we ended up with colonialism and the domination of indigenous peoples, and often genocide of many peoples. So postmodernity is Westerners being embarrassed about the modern world and reacting to that. And so really what they're reacting to is the absolute truths of the modern world. And so they say that there's no truth, all truth is relative, and that actually all reality is about ourselves and our own self-actualization. Another worldview that is in reaction against the modern West is the post-colonial worldview. Particularly, this is located with peoples around the world who are dominated by colonialism, and it And here we can locate Black Lives Matter movement, the Fallist movements, many of the liberation movements of the 20th century have this worldview at their core. Then we have the religious worldview, which tends to be the religions of the book, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. And this worldview seeks to obey the commands in the good book. Then we have the Eastern worldview, which really emerges from the global East. And this worldview has at its core this belief that all reality is one thing. All reality is God, and God is all reality. And really what is wrong is that we see differentiation, and we want to actually accomplish the goal of oneness, of enlightenment, of the realization that all is one and we are part of that whole, and in that way escape the constant cycle of reincarnation. And finally, we identified Trinitarian worldview, which is Orthodox Christianity, where God is not just one, but he is one God in three persons, and because he's three persons, relationality is at the heart of reality. And so those 8 worldviews all seek to answer life's most significant questions, such as where did the world come from? Where did people come from? Where is the world going? What is wrong with the world? How can the world be made right? Who can guide us in terms of making the world right? What is the good life? What is truth? What is freedom? And each and every one of these worldviews answers those big questions in different ways. So let's take, for instance, the question, what is wrong with the world? Well, in the primal worldview, what is wrong with the world is disharmony. In the post-colonial worldview, what's wrong with the world is injustice and oppression. In the ancient West, what's wrong with the world is physicality, that we're a spirit stuck in a physical existence. In the modern West, what's wrong with the world? Ignorance is what's wrong with the world, and we just need to educate everyone. Postmodern Western, what's wrong with the world? Dogma, absolute beliefs is what's wrong, and those absolute beliefs, those truth claims are violent. Religious, what's wrong with the world? Well, sin is what's wrong with the world, and what we mean by that is wrong belief and wrong action. Eastern, what's wrong with the world is the fact that we see differentiation, and actually what we need to do is realize that there's only one, and we want to reach a state of nirvana where there is union with all that is. And then finally, the Trinitarian worldview would say, what's wrong with the world? Sin is what's wrong with the world, but what we mean by that is a broken relationship with a living God. And so all of these worldviews answer the major questions in life in a different way, and all have a foundational myth to them that leads to an internal coherence, a logic, and an explanatory power. They have power to explain the world. For instance, let's take the example, if you lose your job, different worldviews would tend to explain that in different ways. So for instance, a primal worldview might say, if I've just lost my job, might say somebody is to blame for this and I need to find out. Maybe my neighbor cursed me, or maybe the ancestors are unhappy with me and I need to divine that. I need to discover why that is. Post-colonial worldview might say I've lost my job because there are structural inequalities inherent in the marketplace and I am being pushed out for those reasons. Modern Western worldview might say I'm losing my job because the markets are in disarray because of COVID-19, and so the economics of the situation are not working, and so I'm being retrenched. Religious worldview might say I'm losing my job because God is teaching me something, or the devil is up to something. So each of these worldviews would be explaining something like losing your job in a different way, and all of them could be right about it. Often that maybe if you're listening to those explanations of from those different worldviews, and you're thinking, oh, well, that's stupid. Well, that's only because you are thinking in terms of your own logic, of your own worldview, and you're looking across at another worldview and you're saying that worldview or that explanation is stupid. And that's simply because you don't understand the internal logic of that worldview. So we've got to say that every worldview is internally coherent and logical. Secondly, we can also say every worldview longs for something that is good. They long for something that all of us should be longing for. Primal worldview longing for harmony. Post-colonial worldview longing for justice. Ancient Western worldview longing to overcome the constraints of physicality. Modern worldview longing for knowledge. Postmodern worldview longing for self-actualization. Religious worldview longing for morality. Eastern worldview longing for union with God. Trinitarian worldview longing for relationship. All of these worldviews have at their heart something that is good and that we long for. And then another thing we need to notice is that all of us, particularly in a multicultural society like South Africa, are a mix of worldviews. None of us have a pure one worldview, even though we might have a dominant worldview. So all of us are a mix of these different worldviews, and we can trade worldviews. We can change worldviews over time as we become aware of different worldviews. But worldviews are really helpful in explaining why 26 years after apartheid we still talk past one another. For instance, when I was living in Cape Town and we were involved in Gugulethu Township, and we were involved in a squatter community trying to win them housing. This was back in the 1990s. There were taxi wars going on, and a woman I knew well called Lydia Mhlanga said to me one day, look at what our sons are doing, killing each other in these taxi wars. And it struck me so powerfully that she was taking ownership of these young men, none of whom were her physical sons, but they were part of her community. It was her worldview which took ownership of the community. Umtu gumtu gabanya bantu. People are people because of other people. So there is a realization that we are community. And I contrasted that so strongly with people of a white culture who are primarily modern Westerns or postmodern Westerns, who at that stage in our history, you could hardly find any white person who ever admitted that they supported apartheid, because I wasn't personally involved. How completely different, where she's taking full ownership of the troubles within her own community, and white people tend to say, no, it had nothing to do with me because I wasn't personally a soldier or a police officer or whatever. And so we have this incredible clash of cultures within South Africa. So the question is, how does this impact on Black Lives Matter, and particularly on how we enable an enduring revolution of hospitality towards one another here in South Africa? Kops, do you want to give that question a go?
Sure. I mean, Dave, fundamentally, what we take away two very important points from your framing of this understanding of worldviews. A lot of us being unaware of these internal logics or internal logic within our worldview, base assumptions at times we're not aware of. The other is being that in a cosmopolitan place like South Africa, we cannot be composed of solely one view, where we have others who are post-colonial African, but perhaps are Trinitarian or are primal African and religious. So we need to understand that those are the things we're coming to any conversation with. Now, the question of race, or the question of whether Black Lives Matter, which is a proxy really for race. And I think at this point, it's important to say that there's a distinction between the movement and the organization of Black Lives Matter, where here we speak of the organic movement of Black Lives Matter, which seeks to respond to the question of race and inequality. And when we frame an enduring revolution, we're speaking about something that will lead to lasting change, not just simple flashes of anger, which we tend to see and then wither away. In fact, I've got the privilege of working with girls and young men from a number of schools. And my question to them has been consistently around this question of Black Lives Matter, has been, what is the practice in your own life which gives affirmation to the fact that this is something you're seeking to see as an enduring revolution? And it's something I basically have called it the staff member test at school, where young men and women would be on the forefront of addressing the question of Black Lives Matter, but yet would not relate to staff, Black kitchen staff, Black ground staff, from a position in which they would want to be related to. And often the ground staff would be treated differently to faculty, which is a historical difference which persists today, which coexists alongside this question of Black Lives Matter. So what do I think would bring an enduring revolution? Really, it's the question of dialogue. It's being able to have a frank and healthy and a robust discussion on the questions of race. However, it cannot just be a discussion where we're looking at social inequality, culture, economics solely, but it would need to be a discussion where we understand, one, our own worldview and what composes our worldview. What are the things about self which inform what I bring to the discussion, which is a very nuanced way of having a discussion, because often when having a discussion on Black Lives Matter, we express what our opinions are. What we want to start in this discussion is being able to understand what are the assumptions we bring to the conversation and what has informed that historically, be it our parents, our socioeconomics, our entire experience. Because people from different worldviews, different socioeconomic groups, different cultural groups will come with a different set of these assumptions. The other thing, even in this discussion, is identifying gaps in one's own worldview. So you can understand your own view, but now try and understand where your gaps are. And equally, the gaps in those who come to this discussion on race together. And then I think the final one, and this has been missing in the immediate discourse South Africa has had around race in the last decade or so, which would be hospitality. We want to be hospitable to one another. I think I used to say that proximity builds relationship. A lot of the time, it's easy. The EFF and those who were in Senegal this week came to blows because they don't know one another. But if you were to put them in a room and get them to tell one another's life story and expend protracted periods of time with one another, the distance of would be brought much closer. And I think there would be a duty to be hospitable, even across a racial divide, even across a socioeconomic divide. It occurs to me that we must humanize the other person with which we're having a discussion. I have tended to say that even your maid, even your rudimentary staff in your organization have an opinion. It's just that often it goes unlegitimized. And once we humanize and bring this distance closer and we're hospitable with one another, we can begin to chart forth a discussion which would lead to an enduring revolution. So I think more than solving the many, many problems, we just add one dynamic in that we could use worldview as a conceptual framework where we bring our understanding of self, understanding of gaps in self, and then being able to acknowledge, humanize others, and with the hope of being hospitable and together charting forth towards the South Africa we all would love to see.
Brilliant, Cops. Thanks so much. That's amazing. And I just echo that thing of hospitality. How can we be hospitable to one another? Well, you're truly hospitable to someone when you give them time and you listen and you hear their experience. And particularly, we want to, as you've said, we want to hear the worldview that people are coming with and understand that, because then there's true understanding and we're not stumbling around in the dark making assumptions about one another's assumptions. Thanks so much, Cops.
Correct. Thanks, Dave.